Please be advised that Talking Pictures TV has classified the following film as a PG.
Hi, it's Neil Shawnee here on your entertainment news. I'm with a man that really doesn't need any introduction, of course. He's the golden voice of radio, and that's the title of his brand new exclusive book. Remember though, David?
Yes, remember, Neil, if you miss it, you miss out.
Don't miss David today on your entertainment news.
Radio 1, 275 and 285. Solid Gold. Radio 1. Across the nation, 275 and 285. Radio 1.
David, lovely to finally meet you at last. I'm not just saying this, I've finished your book. What a great read. It's like you're chatting to me personally. You've written it all yourself. When you were writing it, was that hard? You know, did the memories come back quite easy, or did you think, oh, hang on a minute, what happened there? You know,
I think I have got quite a good memory, but I think what helped as well was the fact that I was a writer. You know, I started out as a scriptwriter on television, and I'd written quite a lot of articles, and I had written a couple of books before, one of which I think you actually bought. That was David Hamilton's Beauty Tips for Women.
Which was fabulous. Can I just to give the premise of that, people sent you tips. There were genuine tips from your listeners.
Yes.
And there were millions sending you stuff in. And I don't know how I got this book. It was presented to me, but it had all these like very cheap tips in, which today I think it should be republished personally.
Well, there were some wonderful tips. There were things like, you know, if you put tea bags on your eyes, it gets rid of the lines. Yeah. Or if you put yogurt on your face, that's supposed to be all these bizarre things that people were doing.
But they were actually genuinely sending you them in, weren't they? And saying, I do this, David, and then you'd have to read it out.
So what we did was we put it into a book, and we sold it back to the people who'd given us for nothing in the first place. You know.
Actually, that's not a bad idea, is it? You get the contact in, and then you go,
Well, Terry Wogan did that as well, of course. He sold back a lot of material that listeners had very kindly given him, and he used it on his radio show, because he was very clever the way that he used, you know, audience participation, and then sold it back to them afterwards.
Well, I love in your book when you mention the late, great Sir Terry, because obviously I didn't know, I've met him a few times, but I didn't know him like yourself. But I love the line in it, David, where you say he was sort of making out that he wasn't ambitious and he wasn't that.
Yes.
But he was, in fact, a very clever businessman. He had, as you say, a fleet of cars that pick people up. He had other businesses.
Yeah.
I mean, did he come... The public that we knew, the Terry that we knew, was he slightly more ambitious when you knew him as you did, one-to-one?
Well, in my book, I've got a chapter on each of the 11 presenters. I call them the first 11, and Terry is one. And I think the Terry chapter is a very affectionate one. Terry was one of those people, one of those broadcasters who was the same off as he was on. You know, he was a lovely guy. I remember once he asked me to play in a cricket match at Taplow, which is his local village, a charity match. And I said to him, Terry, I haven't played cricket for 20 years. He said to me, if Isla Sinclair can play, you can play. And there was no answer to that. So I played along with Pete Murray and Roy Castle and Ernie Wise, and we had a wonderful day. I think the thing about Terry was that, you know, he had this lovely laid-back style, and he tried to kid us that he was lazy. But of course, as you said, I mean, he was a very driven man. He must have died a multimillionaire. He was a very, very successful man, and a very shrewd man, very clever businessman, but with this lovely Irish charm, of course. But as you said as well, you know, he at one time had the taxi firm that took people to and from the BBC.
I didn't know that. I thought that's very clever.
He also had an agency which handled people like Tony Blackburn and Gloria Hunniford and Kenny Everett. And of course, that meant that he was not only working as an artist, but getting commission from other artists as well, and didn't have to pay an agent because he was his own agent.
Yeah, which, I mean, but when you think about it, I don't think that'd be allowed today. It'd be all cross promotion, wouldn't it? It'd be very difficult to get that.
I think the BBC now have to be so careful about everything that nothing like that would happen today.
Fun.
We've actually got a new thing that's happened recently with the BBC where everybody has become PAYE.
Yeah.
And I think probably because some people were having money paid into funds that went abroad or whatever. Yeah. So my little shows that I do now on BBC Local Radio, I get 20% deducted at source, you know, which is very upsetting.
Now,
Ken Dodd wouldn't like it, would he?
we'll get to Ken shortly, actually. But a couple of stories that I wanted to throw at you. You were, one of your big sort of breaks was working for ATV. Now, ATV is a huge, huge company at this time. You're a very young lad. What was it like in ATV at that time? Because it was Lou Grade, Moguls, all that sort of stuff. Were you nervous?
It was Lou Grade and Val Parnell.
Yeah.
The first job I had was straight from school, was a messenger boy. So I collected and delivered mail to and from the good and the great. So there's people like Lou Grade, who of course became Lord Grade, and Val Parnell, the man behind Sunday Night at the London Palladium. And yes, I mean, it was quite. I was quite.
Were they nice people though? Was Lou nice?
They didn't have a lot to say to me. I was just a little messenger boy. The person I did get talking to was a man called Harold Jameson, who was the head of the script department. And he said to me one day, he said, "You seem like a bright boy." He said, what would you like to do? So I said, "Well, I'm a writer." He said, "What have you written?" So I said, "Well, for a couple of years now, I wrote a column in a magazine called Soccer Star. As it happens, that week I had an article published in TV Times. And one of his department was leaving, Tessa Diamond, who was the woman who created Emergency Ward 10, which I think is probably the first television soap.
That was massive.
Massive.
Just huge.
She was leaving and he needed a new writer, and I took her place. And the first thing I did was I wrote the announcer scripts, so the continuity announcer scripts. And it was all based on promoting the programs, trying to find, nice ways of getting people to watch. And that was the first job. And then Jameson said to me one day, he was doing a Sunday night series called Portrait of a Star.
Oh, I heard of that,
He said, he went out, I think, after the Jack Jackson show on Sunday night. And he said to me, "I'm going to be away on holiday, and I want you to do 2 editions of Portrait of a Star, to write them." So the stars that I wrote about one was Marlon Brando, and the other one was Henry Fonda. And I had to go to a film studio and see their films. I had to pick 2-minute clips that would be a self-contained scene that would give you a good example of their role in that film. And then I had to write this, and I didn't know much about them at all.
You're doing everything, editing, producing, writing.
I think I was 18.
Yeah.
And so my family were living in Fulham in a flat in Fulham that had hot and cold running mice. And I remember the bath was in the kitchen, so to have a bath you had to take the tabletop off. And so it was, fairly humble. And we sat there on Sunday night watching Portrait of a Star, and my name came up, script by. And my mother looked at me,
Proud.
That's my boy. A few tears, maybe.
That is lovely. And as you say, to get that break so young, I mean, we were speaking in the green room a while ago. I don't know if you'd get those sort of breaks now, if you're in that sort of environment, because you've shown some aptitude, and you then this guy sees this and thinks, "Oh, great."
Well, it was a very lucky break, and I was really enjoying my job as a scriptwriter. And one day a buff envelope arrived on the mat, and it was my call up for national service in the RAF. And I thought, God, I've got no interest in guns and marching and war. I hate it all, but you had to do it. But again, I was lucky. I got posted to Germany, and I did my first radio broadcast. I went to see the head of the British Forces Network in Cologne, and I said, "Look, I'm a scriptwriter. Can you use me here? Because, I'm really bored doing all this marching stuff." So he said to me, "Well, we don't actually have writers, but we do need someone to read the football results." So I thought, well, I was always a big football fan, so that was the first thing I did. And then one day I said to him, "You should have some rock and roll." I don't think he knew what rock and roll was. And I said, "All this music that you're playing, Bing Crosby and Peggy Lee," I said, "it's fine for the officers, but the troops want rock and roll." He said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because I am a troop."
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're the age, aren't you?
I was 19.
Yeah.
And Elvis Presley was in Germany at the same time doing his national service with the U.S. Army.
Yeah.
And I think he was in Frankfurt and I was in Cologne. I didn't actually meet him, but I did play his records. And of course the troops loved it because it was Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard,
all the greats,
Fats Domino, all the greats. And the first international star I met, Neil, I've got to tell you, was Connie Francis.
Loved her. Who's sorry
I
now?
I was 19, and she came out to promote her record, Lipstick on Your Collar. And she was small, she was dark, smouldering. She was very sexy, you know.
And you're young.
And I was 19. And there were a dozen of us who met her, and she remembered everybody's name. Isn't that incredible?
Now, that's a star, though, isn't
and
it?
she looked at me, and I was holding my glass, which, by the way, was lemonade, like this. And she looked at me, and she said, "What do you think, David?" And I went, my hand went like this, went, "Connie Francis, big international stars, call me David." I was a little sprog in the RAF, couldn't believe it. So, did I play her record? I certainly did.
And you probably play them now, don't you? Still, 'cause
Yes,
you love us,
I still play it now.
Yeah.
And of course, it got onto Family Favourites, which is the Cologne end of the big radio show of the week. And so she got lots of plays for Lipstick on Your Collar, and I always remember that.
Yeah. Oh, Connie, you see, it's lovely again, isn't it? Because you're talking about a time when stars were stars, and when they arrived, you felt their presence almost, didn't you? It was certain people have that, you know, when they come into a studio and you think, yes, you know, you've got to kind of up your game. I mean, when I read your book, you have had a fascinating life, though, because you've done. I would say the reason to your success is you've been diverse. And you've done so many different things. You've been an announcer, on-screen announcer.
Yeah.
I mean, that again was a big job, you know, for Thames TV and stuff like that.
It was when announcers appeared in vision
Yeah.
between programs. And I tried to inject a little bit of humour into it. And I remember once really upsetting Noel Gordon because the continuity writers, you know, doing what I had done before. Now I've got somebody writing scripts for me, which is great. And the continuity writer wrote, "Tonight, an actor arrives at the Crossroads Motel." So I delivered this line to camera, and then looking at the clock, which is just next to the camera, I realised I'd still got 2 seconds left, so something to fill in with. So it came out like this: "Tonight, an actor arrives at the Crossroads Motel, not before time." So the phone rings in the studio, and it's Noel Gordon.
Not an assistant, but the actual person.
"David, I'm very upset with you." "Why is that, Noel?" "What you just said about my program." I said, "Well, I'm sorry." I said, "But it's what everybody says about your program." So she said, well, and she was not happy. But luckily, that was an ATV program, and I was now working for Thames.
Because she
it was
would have
okay.
had the power to fire you, though, wouldn't she? She was so big.
She was very, and very friendly with Val Parnell, by the way.
Yeah. Gosh. So you see now, the bit that I like in the book, of course, is, you've mentioned that you've got all the top people that were in that golden era, as they call it, of Radio 1. When you got to the BBC, because I love this part of the book, when you get there, you can't quite believe it. You know, you've kind of got in there because it's the dream, isn't it? And it's the golden ticket for anybody who's in radio at that time.
Yeah.
You want to be on there. So what was it like when you first walked through Broadcasting House? Were you floating a bit?
I was part of what I call the radio generation, because I lived on a very remote farm in Sussex, and the radio was the window to my world, this little magic box in the corner of the room, because I was an only child. The only person I had to play with was my sheepdog, Scamp. And so, you know, I heard these crowds at football matches like, you know, St James's Park or White Hart Lane. What would it be like to be in and then I heard all the great variety shows that were on the Light programme, things like Itmar and Take It From Here and stuff like that.
So funny, though, aren't they?
But these radio people were and I used to impersonate them. And at Christmas time, I would entertain my family with, I won't take my coat off, I'm not stopping. You know, all these comedians had their catchphrases. Yeah. Can I do you now, sir?
Yeah.
You know, I used to do all that. And so now suddenly in the 60s, I'm doing my first broadcast in Broadcasting House, which is, as you know, a very impressive building. And I walk in through those portals, and I can hear the voices of all the ghosts of all the great broadcasters I've heard down the years. And I thought, suddenly, I'm here. You know, I'm going to be one of those. People are going to be listening to me. And you know, I still can't understand how my voice goes into that microphone and comes out of somebody's radio. Yeah. All these years I've been doing it. How does it work? I don't know.
And as you say, though, you get in there, and it's a big success for you. You climbed your way in, and then you got more success. And you were the DJ that was simulcast on Radio 1 and Radio 2, which they wouldn't do that now, would they? I mean, it was,
Well, that was an economy move. The BBC.
Great for you, though.
I was on Radio 1, and they chopped the programme on Radio 2. So that gave us an enormous audience. I mean, nobody knows quite what the audiences were, but depending on which newspaper you read, it could have been 18, 19, could have been 20 million people. Audiences that would only be dreamt of now because there are so many different radio stations. I mean, I called the book The Golden Days of Radio 1, and it was the golden days because certainly in the first 6 years, there were no other radio stations. It was the only music station. And also at that particular time, we're talking about 60s and early 70s, music appealed across the board from grandparents to grandchildren. The same families who watched Top of the Pops, which was hosted by Radio 1 DJs, were the people who listened to Radio 1. And they all liked David Cassidy, and they all liked Donny Osmond. So that doesn't happen now, I mean, can you imagine now grandparents liking the same music as their grandchildren?
You're spot on, actually, because it's true. It's like the Bay City Rollers were very ineffectual, really. They didn't offend anybody. It was just nice music, just good pop music.
Well, they upset Johnny Walker. He didn't want to play them, and he left the BBC and went to work in America because he didn't want to play the Bay City Rollers. I played them. I actually toured with them. You know, it wasn't the music that I was wildest about.
But they were massive.
Yeah, I mean, Rollermania.
And so you're this huge DJ on Radio 1. They're the biggest band in the world. It's like One Direction today, isn't it? And you're out there with them. I mean, that must have been very exciting, though, to be with them and touring around.
Well, there was the classic broadcast from Mallory Park.
I remember this.
Racetrack. And I was comparing it with Annie Nightingale. The Bay City Rollers were guests there, and it was the height of Rollermania. And they actually got onto a boat on a lake to get away from their female fans, who all jumped in fully clothed and swam out after them. So, I mean, it made quite a story at the time. I mean, all these girls were absolutely drenched, obviously.
And it's worrying, actually, because, you don't know what's going to happen, do you? I mean, the fans can be quite nutty.
Somebody could have drowned.
Yeah, easily. It could have been very disastrous.
And when I compared the David Cassidy tour, there was, if you remember, a stage collapsed and somebody was killed. And David Cassidy, he died just recently. He was a very interesting character. I got to know him very well comparing his tour. One of the things that he hated was the girls screaming, because he was a good singer and he wanted them to hear him sing. So what he did was he put cotton wool in his ears so he couldn't hear the girls screaming, and then unfortunately he couldn't hear the band.
You've got to laugh, though, haven't you? Because, I mean, I met him briefly, David Cassidy. He was a little bit, shall we say, different in the period that I met him. But, I mean, you're talking about when people were, because this is pre-internet, and their power as stars was driven through fan base.
Well, he was a very good-looking boy, David Cassidy, and young women were wild about him. I mean, when he came over here and toured, during the day, he would like to have gone horse riding, but he couldn't. So he spent his entire time holed up in his hotel room, and the girls used to shin up the drain pipes and try to get into his room, So, I mean, a lot of people would think that was great, but he wasn't happy with it. And when it's sad, he looked back on his life. Do you know the last words that he said? Terribly sad. He said, "So much wasted time."
Wow.
Talking Pictures TV.
The jingles on Radio 1 were so iconic.
Yes.
And you don't realise that now. When you listen to radio now, they're quite bland, But the 275, 285 National Radio 1.
Wonderful Radio 1.
Wow, and very and very beautifully sung, but, tight harmonies, that sort of stuff. And you to anybody of our generation, you play that and you can go straight back to your little transistor, listening to you coming out.
But you have to remember as well, Neil, that until that particular time, you hadn't had jingles on the BBC. In the light programme, you had scripted programmes. It was very formal and it was scripted, and it was only the pirates coming along that brought in the jingles. And when they launched Radio 1, they've said, two things we've got to do. We've got to sign up lots of pirate radio DJs to placate the public who've lost all their pirate radio stations, and you've got to have lots of jingles to make it sound like the pirates, and that's why they did it. But they were great. I think they were made in America.
Just brilliant stuff.
Yeah, wonderful.
And I think that was as much part of the brand that you had, because you've got a very distinctive voice. I mean, to me, I know you straight away whenever I hear you on the radio. But looking back at that period for you, you are now, all of those Radio 1 DJs, particularly the daytime ones, are superstars. I mean, you're bigger than some of the pop records you're playing, because when you went to do stuff, like you talk about opening stores and doing nightclub appearances, it's you that's driving the audience in. That must have been confusing for the BBC.
You wouldn't get that now because there's so much radio, and of course there are superstar DJs. I mean, there are people like Chris Evans and Steve Wright.
He's probably the last one, though.
Yeah, probably the last ones. Yeah. On the cover of the book, there are 11. They were all household names. Yeah. There was Emperor Roscoe, for example, who was the first American DJ. Yeah. And I'll do my Roscoe impression if you like. Would you like that?
I remember it. Yeah.
My. Have mercy, baby, I'm gonna blow your mind.
Yeah, I remember.
Excuse me, murders your throat. Yeah. And the first time he did it, the newsreader came on and said in a very formal voice, I'm gonna blow your mind, baby. And the newsreader said, and now the news in English. Isn't that wonderful? And then there was Fluff Freeman, of course, who was the first Australian. Yeah. Greetings, pop pickers, not off.
But he was great, though, wasn't he? He's another one. It was just, I think this is the thing. You all had your own individual personalities. And it's like anything. You tune into the ones that you liked, I remember going on the bus to school, and Tony Blackburn was the breakfast show host. But I remember him saying, this is live across the nation from Broadcasting House in London. And I remember sitting on this bus in Dewsbury thinking, I wonder where that is. Like you were saying, it's like, where's Broadcasting House? And wow.
Well, talking about Fluff Freeman, he had a feature on his program in the afternoon called Get It Off Your Chest, which was a way that people could write in, because in those days we wrote in, didn't we? Postcards and all of that.
And you just thought it was actually going to be read, didn't you?
It was, maybe a week later. You had to have had to go through all the system and then finally get read out. But people, with this, Get It Off Your Chest, people could write in and talk about things that really annoyed them. But some people took it the wrong way, and lots of women sent him their bras. So they were hanging all over. The first time I saw him in the studio, I walked in there, and all these bras were hanging up all over the studio. Now, that wouldn't happen today either, would it?
No. Well, somebody would take a picture, and then that would be turned into a crisis.
Yes.
You know what I mean? It'd be like,
sackable offence probably today.
Well, I think what's interesting is, as I said, there's so many great people that were on the channel at the time. And the fun thing that comes from me is it was entertaining. You were all fun. You all had your own personalities. Yeah. I used to love the sort of backstabbing things you did as you crossed over. Everybody did it. Yes. But it was great, because you weren't quite sure.
Well, Blackburn and I were the first people to have two daily 3-hour radio shows. He had 3 hours in the morning, I had 3 hours in the afternoon, and we decided to be rude about each other. So, we would do, there's nothing he wouldn't do for me and nothing I wouldn't do for him, and that's how we go through life, doing nothing for each other. And then he did an entire edition of Top of the Pops wearing a T-shirt saying, I hate David Hamilton, which of course was wonderful publicity. Yeah. And people speculated, did they really hate each other or did they get on? Well, actually, we were good friends. I was his best man when he got married for the second time. And, we were good pals. So it was like, but people wanted to think that we hated.
It's kind of good for you. I mean, you mentioned Top of the Pops again. That must have been thrilling, David, to be a host on there because it's the #1 show. And we all sat on a Thursday night watching it. And you never really knew who was the host because he didn't sometimes say in the Radio Times or whatever. So you'd turn up and you think, oh, it's those two or whatever. And the ones that I remember, you always had an exuberance. You always seemed like you wanted to be there. Whereas John Peel looked like he was, and you kind of think, well, why don't they just get somebody that likes these then, So what was it like introducing
that was his style, wasn't it? And in a way, that's what made him different. Yeah. But I was very excited to be there, and something that, again, having watched it for so many years, to be at the first show, really nervous. But the thing that struck me about it the first time I walked into the studio was how small the set was. Of course, with clever direction, it looked a lot bigger. But it was very small. There were probably about 100 teenagers who were just went from one set to another, you know, and as David Essex finished his number over here, floor manager would herd them over to this way, and then Rod Stewart would be there doing his song, you know. And the other thing about it was, you know, nowadays you hear about people earning a lot of money with the BBC. For doing Top of the Pops, I never earned £100. I think the most I ever got was about 90 quid. And I remember we used to record it on a Wednesday night, and afterwards I used to do a disco in a pub in the Old Kent Road called the Dun Cow, which is now a dentist surgery, funnily enough. And I probably got about 3 times as much for working to 200 people in a pub in the Old Kent Road as I got for doing a national television programme watched by 15 million. Wow. But of course, the TV show gave you the shop window for the gigs.
It's the exposure, isn't it? You know.
Yeah.
What were the acts that you remember that you liked on the show? Because I mean, I always thought it was. It must have been so exciting for you as the host to be close to some of these, you know, which are now icons like Rod, as you say, and people like that.
Do you know the pop star I was most excited to meet? I think you'd be quite surprised.
Go on.
Roy Orbison.
Oh, I loved Roy Orbison, yeah.
And I tell you why. One of the first records I bought was Only the Lonely by Roy Orbison. And I used to play it on my father's radiogram. There were radiograms. And my father said to me, why are you playing the same record over and over again? And I said, because it's fantastic. That's what we did then. We got a record, we loved it.
Wore it out.
And wore it out. You play it over and over on an old 78. Yeah. And so now suddenly, like we're sitting in this studio, and sitting opposite me is the Big O. And he's got the shades on, you know. I thought, this man has been a star all my lifetime. Yeah. And finally, I've actually got to meet the Big O. He was a lovely... I did one of the last television interviews with him, and he died not long afterwards. And when he died, a clip of our interview was actually shown on the news at 10. Wow. And for me, you know, I had interviewed, you know, Elton John, Rod Stewart, I mean, loads of the greats, and compared the Beatles, compared the Rolling Stones in concert. I've got a good story for you about the Rolling Stones. 1963 or 1964. 1964, I'm comparing the Rolling Stones in concert at the Palace Theatre in Manchester. And when I say comparing, they had lots of support acts in those days, topped by the Rolling Stones. Yeah. So I had a little red MGB sports car that I was rather proud of, and I parked it at the back of the theatre, as you could in those days. Somebody, thinking it was Mick Jagger's car, scratched a message to him on the bonnet. So for a week, I was driving my car around with "I love you, Mick" on the bonnet.
But just you know what you're saying there, David, just the fact that the Rolling Stones are at the Palace Theatre is a weird thing to think, isn't it? Because they're like arena stadium global stars now, you know. But
early days of their career, somebody got a lucky booking, hadn't they?
Yeah.
They got them before, you know, and they'd had a few hit records before then. When I compared the Beatles, that was the same thing. Brian Poole and the Tremolos, a couple of other support acts as well. That was again in Manchester, and I remember my fee was 10 guineas. That was £10 and 10 shillings. And you know, the funny thing is, I'm still on the same money now.
Well, aren't we all?
Where did I go wrong?
But you know, it must have been so thrilling, though, when you think, because these are, even then, they were massive bands. Did you, because, you know, you worked in music all your life, did you see the long thing in these people? Did you think, I could see these people having a long career, or did you see them as
I don't think anybody
stars,
could know that it would last as long as it has done. The Beatles, of course, split up at the end of the 60s. Stones, with, you know, 1 or 2 changes of personnel, still going. I could see that they were going to be very big for a long time. You know, the Beatlemania was certainly here. And then at that time in the 60s, people either loved the Beatles or the Stones, didn't they? You were one or the other. If you were a bit more establishment, you probably liked the Beatles. And then if you were a bit more of a rebel, you probably liked the Stones. You know, they were naughty boys, weren't they?
But when you went on the stage and there's all these screaming Beatles fans, could you be heard? Because, I mean, they must have just been screaming, we want John, you know, we want Ringo.
Well,
and you're like, hello?
Yeah, actually, you're absolutely right. And with the Rolling Stones, when that was a bill, and there were other support acts as well, I can remember going on and introducing Julie Grant, I think, who was a girl singer at the time. And as I was introducing her, they were all chanting, "We want the Stones, we want the Stones." How awful for an act to come on when all they wanted was the Rolling Stones. And there was one compere of shows like that who actually found the answer to it. And he told me about it. And he said, what I did was I stood on my head. So I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, I stood on my head and I said to them, until you shut up, I'm not coming down.
Oh!
He said, I was there for about 2 minutes. He said, but eventually they shut up, and then I stood up and said, and now here are the Rolling Stones, whoever it was. So if I had learnt to stand on my head, it might have been really useful.
Oh, that's risky, though, today, isn't it? Can you imagine? They start throwing things at you, you know. They wouldn't bother now,
Yeah,
would they?
no.
It'd be a lot different, you know.
Yeah, but it worked for him.
I've got to bring in, because as ever, we never get enough time on these things, but I've got to bring in, you did a successful pantomime at one of my favourite venues, the Bradford Alhambra.
Oh, lovely.
Tell me the Ken Dodd story.
Right. After working with Ken Dodd on Doddy's Music Box and getting the nickname Diddy David.
I always wondered where that came from.
Yeah.
Now I get it, the Diddy meant.
Doddy, well, I was his straight man, or his interviewer, if you like. And during rehearsals, he called me Diddy David. And he took me to one side afterwards, and he said to me, in fairness to him, he said, do you mind me calling you that? He said, because if you mind, I won't do it anymore. He said, but if you don't mind, I think it'll stick.
Yeah.
And I said, I don't mind, and I've been stuck with it now for 50 years. So there you are. Anyway, after Doddy's Music Box, I got my first pantomime. You're absolutely right, Bradford Alhambra. I was playing Buttons in Cinderella. And Ken Dodd turns up one day after the matinee and comes backstage and says, come on, I'm taking you out for dinner. So Ken was known to be, what should we say?
Cautious.
Cautious. That's a good word. Cautious.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, that's very nice.
Yeah.
Anyway, we go across the road to Gold Sachs Fish and Chip Parlour. We go into, it's unlicensed, we go into the back parlour. He takes off his overcoat, takes 2 bottles of lager out of his overcoat pocket, puts them down on the counter and says, cotton chips twice, love. So we sit there. We have cotton chips, we have a swig of lager, and he gives me money, advice, not money, he gives me money. Said money again. I've got money on the mind with Ken Dodd.
It's because you haven't paid you.
Ken Dodd. He gives me advice that money can't buy.
Yeah.
And Ken was a wonderful Buttons, and he said to me, he said, you've got the bubbly bit, you've got to work on the pathos. He said, you've got to remember, Cinderella is a cow. He said she's only running off with the prince because he's loaded, he's got loads of money. Yeah. She really loves you, you're the little page boy, and she really loves you. And you got to work on the pathos. And he gave me advice on how to do that. So the next day, I thought to myself, well, Ken and I could have gone to the best hotel in Bradford. We could have gone to Yates's wine bar, couldn't we?
Yeah.
And we could have had a slap-up meal. We could have talked about football and holidays, instead of which we went to the fish and chip shop, we had cotton chips, we had lager, and he's given me this priceless advice, so I've got to work on it. So anyway, a couple of nights later, I'm doing the kitchen scene where I sing Smile to Cinderella. Smile though your heart is aching. Charlie Chaplin song. And normally, after I sang it to her, that's when she ran off with the prince. On this particular night, I'm walking off to the wings, and a little boy in the front row shouts out, Cinders, marry Buttons. So I got on the phone to Ken. He said, well done, son. He said, you're on your way. Wow.
And that is lovely, isn't it? Because, and that proves why he's successful, because he studied it. You know, I think a lot of people go into panto and they get the script and they just do it. But it is a very skilled genre, I think, to get kids on your side. You know.
Well, it is, and he was brilliant at it. And I'll tell you a couple of other stories about Ken. As you know, this year he got his knighthood.
Yeah.
And I've been doing a theatre tour, David Hamilton's Rock and Roll Back the Years. Sometimes I do a little gag or two about Ken, working with him. Anyway, I came off stage, and the stage manager said to me, he said, we had Ken here in our theatre recently. I said, yeah. He said, what time do you think the audience went home? I said, tell me. He said, 2:30 in the morning. Now, he's just had, November, his 90th birthday. So I rang him up, and I said, congratulations, Ken. He said, well, I'm going into politics now. I said, really, as what? He said, Chancellor of the Exchequer.
You have to laugh at Ken, though, because he did turn that whole episode into just, as only he can, cracking humour.
He says in his act, he says, I'm not worried about the tax man. He said, I'm fully paid up to 1973.
Yeah, I mean, and it's true.
He said, I can remember the days when income tax was 2 pence in the pound. I thought it still was.
Yeah. But I think that, that's an art lesson as well, as when we all have problems in your career. And I wondered how he would get out of that, because you wonder, as a comedian, you think, how is that going to bounce out?
Well, he had a wonderful QC, George Carman. And George Carman famously said, a lot of accountants are comedians, but no comedians are accountants, which was a terrific line.
And true,
and true.
Yeah.
But I learned a lot of things working with Ken. He said to me, we did 2 series of Doddy's Music Box, went out on ITV on Saturday nights, one in 67, one in 68. And he often used these words. He said, listen and learn. And one of the things that I learnt from him is that he always had time for people.
Yeah.
And people would come backstage, they'd go to his dressing room. He could be there till 1 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the morning. He would be there signing autographs and talking to people until the last one had gone, and then finally he would go home.
Yeah.
And, it's those lessons that you learn. And I think I started in the business when, there was a lot to be learnt from old pros.
Yeah.
Talking Pictures TV.
Yeah, it's talent though, isn't it? You talk about it, but I mean, I think nowadays everybody wants to be a radio DJ. And a lot of people from your era are called radio personalities. But to me, a personality is somebody that entertains you while playing the music that you like.
Yes.
And the links have to be, encouraging, thoughtful, that sort of thing. I think it's very strange, because you in your book said you're surprised that nobody's ever put a radio station together with people that were so well loved that would still draw an audience. And it's funny, isn't it?
Now, if you did, and you had a gold station playing, golden oldies like they have in New York, they have a station like that with, a whole bunch of senior DJs. It was tried at Capitol Gold, but the problem was it had an AM signal. And nowadays, you've got to have FM or DAB or, a lot of people now listen on the internet, but that will be more for the future, But if you had them together, unfortunately, a lot of Radio 2 now want to have television personalities on radio rather than real radio people. And I think that's a shame.
And I think there are two different types of characters. There are people that just are great on radio, that should remain on radio and not on TV. I mean, I'm a big fan of another really, Steve Wright. I thought he was a genius, comedy mind, everything. But it was all in the vision of your head.
Yes.
When he started to do it on TV, it didn't quite work.
No.
I was thinking, you don't look how I imagined you're going to look.
I think he would know that now, and I think he would stick to what it's good at. It's good at. I mean, you mentioned earlier that I had diversified, and I have. I mean, working with people like Ken Dodd, also Tommy Cooper. Benny.
What was he like,
Benny
though?
Hill.
Benny Hill and Tommy Cooper. I mean, they were great people. I mean,
well, wonderful. I mean, again, so much to be learnt from working with them, and all the gags about Tommy Cooper. There's a lovely story about him, and once again, a lot of the old pros were very tight. Very careful with money.
But I think that's fear, don't you? Though, David,
I do.
Like they're working now, but they might not be working in 2 weeks.
Do you know what I think? I think that's absolutely right. And what I believe is that I think comedians have this fear that they're going to wake up in the morning and not be funny anymore.
Yeah.
And what an awful, how awful when, very difficult thing to do, isn't it, to make people laugh. There are days when you and I might feel funny, and days that we feel about as funny as a bowl of rice pudding.
But it's true, but they've got to go on and do it.
They have to be, in a way that, a plumber has to fix drains or pipes, they have got to be, by order, funny. That's otherwise they've let people down. And so a lot of them were very tight, and Tommy was said to be very tight. And of course, one of his things he would say with taxi drivers, he'd get out of the cab and he'd say, "Have a drink on me," and give them a tea bag.
But he's great. I wouldn't dare do that though, would you, Dave? I just wouldn't dare do it. You know,
but they're
like,
going to go home and say to the wife, aren't they? You know, I got a tip from Tommy Cooper
well,
today.
yeah, because he's a megastar, isn't he? That's the thing. I mean, you mentioned Benny Hill. I met him very briefly. I once went to his flat in Queensway or Kingsway or whatever it was, and he struck me as a very lonely person.
Yes,
you know, he had,
I think so.
He was just watching TV. He had lots of TVs there, and he was very keen to sort of tell me that he was up on the right comedy, and you know. But I think he was, to me, one of the greatest. He was, I think, our answer to Charlie Chaplin. I thought he was genius. You know, because when he didn't speak, those silent films he made, genius. You know, it's a shame he got lost in the sex.
No, well,
thing,
the shame was that we got into all the political correctness thing, and suddenly his programs were deemed not to be that. Of course, they were enormously successful in America and all around the world. And I still get little royalties, not much, but little royalties coming through from the sketches. I remember one sketch very well that I did with him, and he gave me this funny line, and I introduced him, and he was actually the first contestant in a male beauty contest. Can you imagine that? It came on in little shorts and everything. So I introduced him and I said, now here's our I was wearing the dicky bow, you know, the compere. And I said, now here's our first contestant, Ivor Biggin from Mill Hill. And he looked at me and he said, no. He said, I'm Ivor Mill from Biggin Hill.
Oh, what a great line. It's a good line, though. And that's what makes him clever.
But he gave me the funny line about the Ivor Biggin, you know.
And I think a good comedian is not frightened to give away a good line. It's like Victoria Wood. She wrote brilliantly for the cast of people that she had, I think.
Yes.
And gave away the better laughs to the Julie Walterses and the people with her.
That's generous. And Ken was like that, you know, Ken as well, because in Doddy's Music Box, he had a repertory of actors, people like Graham Stark and Rita Webb and John Laurie. And very often he gave them funny lines. And Rita Webb said to him one week, she said that, you know, during rehearsal, she said, here, Ken, you know, real out and out, broad Cockney. She said, here, Ken, she said, I've got no funny lines in this sketch. She said, all I am is a little fat woman. She said, give me some funny lines. So he said, well, Rita, you're funny anyway. You're funny to look at. You're funny anyway. Yeah, but I need some more fun. So he gave us some more funny lines, you know.
Which is, as you say, generous, isn't it, you know?
Well, Eddie Braben was writing with him. He was brilliant scriptwriter, then went on to write for Morecambe and Wise.
See, you've been so lucky to be in with this, what I call your book's called The Golden Age of Radio, but you've been in the golden period, in my opinion, of entertainment. You know, I mean, just as you say, working with like Eddie Braben, you know, Benny Hill, these are people that we, you know, are still so famous today and so popular. You know, maybe not, I think, terribly overlooked in here. When you see those documentaries, you know, of these, you know, when they do these like drama plays of people, they're doing one, I think, on Morecambe and Wise and Eddie Braben at Christmas. Because you've worked with them, I'm often intrigued as whether you think, well, that's not, well, it wasn't really like that. You know,
it's
what
a bit like a statue, isn't it? It never quite looks like the real thing.
I'm amazed that the writers, the script writers, don't come to people like you've actually worked with them and say, what was he like? You know, off camera.
Do you know, I get really fed up about that. I see programs about people that I've worked with, and you know, people are going on there, I've never met them. I've just seen them on telly. I'll tell you somebody else that I admired greatly, and I like to think was a good friend, was Bob Monkhouse.
I love Bob.
He was so clever. And a lot of people thought he was smarmy on television because he worked in a very slick American way. But you had to see him live. And I saw him live a few times, and I went to see him once at Bailey's at Watford.
A huge venue in the time, though.
Huge venue. And the stage was up here, and the audience were sitting at tables down there. And I had a drink with him and Jackie, his wife, he liked to have a glass of whiskey before the show, before he went on. And he said to me, the most terrible thing happened last night. I said, what was it, Bob? He said, well, I had a heckler in. He said, and you know me. He said, I can handle hecklers. I said, nobody better. I've got all the put-down lines in the world. He said, but I don't know what happened. He said, but something snapped. And he said, I went over to the table and I kicked him in the teeth. He said, and I came back to the dressing room afterwards. I thought, God, he's going to be waiting for me after the show. He's going to beat me up or something. He said, but luckily he didn't. I think he'd had a few drinks, and the family said, look, you know, let's go home. But I thought, you know, again, Neil, you know, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because you think even the greats, there's a point at which they snap. There's a point at which they think, yeah, I can't hack this. Yeah,
I mean, I love Bob Monkhouse. I was lucky enough to meet him a couple of times, and near the end, and he came into a radio station of all places, and the terrible thing happened. You know, we're chatting before doing the interview, and I don't know what happened, but this girl came along with some coffees on a tray, And she realises it's Bob Monkhouse and goes, and the tray capsizes into all of his fabulous, because he was beautifully dressed, fabulous suit, everything,
My God.
And when you both sit there and go, and then look at her,
What
then
did
look
he
down.
say?
I just said, I'm Bob, and the girls just, saunters off, and we had to do the interview, which was filmed, and he had a Heart FM T-shirt on him, and Bob was beautifully
But
turned
what did
out,
he say to her? Nothing?
Nothing. He said, "Oh, look, it's fine."
He was a
it's fine."
gentleman.
Just so nice, and I said, "Oh, Bob, we must pay for this cleaning, And he said, "Well," and because he always had these like safari type things on, it was very light.
Oh, yes.
And it was stained, I could see that it was. I thought this ain't coming out, And he never said anything or whatever. And every time we saw each other again, he said, "You haven't got any coffee, have you?" You know what I mean? And I thought he was such a lovely man. So again, when you told me that,
I did
I
Celebrity
think,
Squares with him a few times.
it was a great show.
That was
wasn't
great
it?
to do. And Blankety Blank I did with Wogan. That was always good fun to do.
Yeah.
But no, I've been very lucky really to work with these great pros. And I struggle now, I've got to be honest. I watch some of the comedy, stand-up comics now, and most of them I don't find as funny as what I deem to be the all-time greats,
Well, I find, when you look at, say, some of the greats, you just mentioned, the Tommies and all those sort of people, they went out with just a microphone and themselves.
Yeah.
I saw a guy recently on TV, allegedly a comedian, who had, all he talks about is stats from Google. He's got a computer screen. And, it's like a geography teacher. I thought, I'd love to put you in a venue with people that want to be made laugh without all of that paraphernalia and say, make me laugh. Because I don't think they can do it.
I know. The other thing I don't like all the expletives.
Yeah.
And you're hearing the F word on television, peak time or maybe on Saturday night.
Yeah.
None of the great comics needed to do that. They didn't need it.
Funny's funny, isn't it? I think funny is funny. If you're funny,
Bob Monkhouse, for example, could be very smutty.
Yeah.
But it was funny.
Yeah.
But he didn't just use an expletive.
But it's where your mind went when he said things. It's what you were thinking, because he'd look at you as if, and then you were thinking,
Max Miller.
Yeah.
Max Miller, who was, the cheeky chappie, but the jokes from the Blue Book, all right, I was very lucky to see him live. I saw him right at the end of his career, one of his last shows, Finsbury Park Empire, I think it was. And he came on and he told a joke, and people thought, it would be nothing today. I won't repeat it, but really it would be nothing today. But at that time, the audience thought it was so outrageous. Here's a funny thing. Now this is a funny thing.
Yeah.
And a lot of comics, I think, Dottie must have been inspired by Max Miller. Jimmy Tarbuck, definitely,
Yeah, and did you see these people have still got, like Jimmy Tarbuck, I saw him recently, he's still a very funny man.
Yeah.
Knows how to handle an audience, comes on very confident. I saw him on a TV show, The Palladium thing, and he came on and did a bit of a tribute about Scylla. But the guy who was hosting it, and I can't remember if it was Jack White or something, he just took it off him so expertly, and then when he left, it flapped. And I thought, you could learn from that. You know what I mean? Watch what he's done.
I think there's a lot to be learned from the old pros. And I think, they should be given more recognition. And certainly if they're still alive, like Tarby, we should see more of them.
Definitely. Now, listen, David, I'm going to have to say, we should see more of you. It's been an absolute thrill to chat. I could chat to you all day. You've got so many stories. Your book's out now. Tell me, why should we buy your book, The Golden Age? Tell me why, if we're watching now, why should we buy it?
Shall I hold it up?
Yeah.
Well, this is the golden days of Radio 1. There's a chapter about each of these people here on the cover, the first 11. Each one of them, all recognisable faces, all have some lovely pictures inside.
There are, actually.
Lovely picture.
Yeah.
Can I show your viewers a
sure.
lovely picture here? One of my favourite pictures is this one with the 3 degrees. And I sort of discovered them. They were singing on Sunday night at the London Palladium. They sang a song called Year of Decision. And I said to my producer, could I have that as the Hamilton Hot Shot, my record of the week? And he said yes. And then the follow-up was When Will I See You Again, which of course was a multi-million seller.
And played now, isn't it? Still on radio now.
Will be played forever.
Yeah.
And when it sold the million, the record company asked me, would I go to the Victoria Apollo where they were doing a concert, and would I present them with a gold disc? And I said, of course I will. So I walked out on stage. Nobody knew I was going to be there. and I was holding in my hand the gold disc, and I said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you, When Will I See You Again has sold 1 million. The place erupted. I handed the gold disc to Sheila Ferguson. The band struck up, and I stood in the wings with a lump in my throat. They never sang it better, and they sang When Will I See You Again. Fantastic.
David Hamilton, you've been fantastic. Thank you so much for being my guest today. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.